The direct shear test is a routine test that is conducted to determine the strength properties of soil or the strength of soil. And you'll see later on that we have to be careful when we say the strength or the strength, not really the strength properties, but the strength parameters of soil. They are different. One is the strength and the other ones are the strength parameters. Okay, so in this test, what we attempt to do is to mimic the condition of a block sliding on a plane so that we can get the strength. Okay? Now, remember that in this case, this is the normal force, which is the weight in this case, right? We have defined the force required to push the block or to cause the incipient movement of the block, which we defined as the failure condition, the incipient movement. We just defined it like this. This is Amonton's rule, right? Now, when we run the test in the lab, let's say we had to run this test in the lab. Generally, what would you try to find? Well, you would say, okay, I have a plane, I have a block, right? I'm just going to push this until it starts moving. At the moment it starts moving, I get my T, and that's a strength. 30 newtons, let's say, whatever, right? Well, generally what you would be finding in a test like this is not the strength, that is what you would measure, right? You would measure this. But what you cannot get, or what you cannot measure unless you measure the strength first, is this one right here. So notice, you measure the force required to push the block, which is the strength in this case, right? And then you realize that you have applied a given N to the plane, which means that you know what the weight of the block is. I'm just bringing the N down here, right? And then you can actually get this mu. And this is how you would measure mu. And remember that mu is a function of the block material, the plane material, and the fluid in the pores at the interface. There's no easier way to determine what mu is for two materials in contact other than this way, which is push until it fails. So you create the failure condition, determine the strength, which is the force required to push the block at basically, which defines failure in this case, divided by the normal force on the plane, which is just the weight of the block in this case, right? So notice what we've done. We've measured the strength, imposed an N, and determined what is called the strength parameter. That is not the strength. That is the strength parameter that defines what's happening, or not what's happening, that defines the interaction between this material, and the fluid in here. And also the characteristics of the surface. Remember, we looked at this under the microscope, let's say, and it looked like this. Maybe the block looks like that. So that ruggedness here is also captured by this mu. Okay? So this is what we're going to do for soil. We are not in search of the strength. We measure the strength because we take the specimen to failure. Therefore, we can extract the strength just measuring it. And then we solve for what are in our case there will be two strength parameters. Okay? And this is what you would be, let's say, paid for if you were to run lab tests on a soil, if you had a firm that does lab testing. Okay? So we're going to replicate this in the lab for soil. How do we do that? Direct shear. So, as you've seen in the video and in the lab, we have a box. The box is split in half such that the top part can move relative to the bottom part. The top part is open, so there's a plate that rests on the soil specimen, which is here. This line here is to show you that the bottom of the box is separate from the top. The bottom is fixed. Sometimes the top is fixed and the bottom moves. Sometimes the bottom is fixed and the top moves. That doesn't really matter. What matters is the concept, at least for these lectures here. So this is all fixed. The top of the box is not, right? So what do? We push, look, we push on the top part to create a failure surface. This is the force that we impose. How do we impose it? Well, there's a motor that basically pushes a rod onto the top part of the box, right? And it just continues to move constantly at a constant rate. And there's a device here that measures what force is being imposed, right? Clearly, if the top of the box starts moving, right, then there's a decrease in the force because the rate is constant, okay? But just the main point is that there is a thing moving constantly, or a constant rate, sorry, pushing the box, and there's something in between that rod and the box, which is a load cell that measures the force, okay? Now, here's the plane in question, just like this plane, right? Here's T. This force is the force acting on this plane. What is the force acting on this plane? We impose it by adding weights to the system. Let's call it W, okay? So we place some weights in here on top. Sometimes we actually hang them from the bottom, resting on a hanger on the top, but basically the force is applied to the top, and therefore is applied to it is assumed that it's applied to the surface. So this W force is being applied here to this plane. So what are the forces on this plane? Normal to the plane, W. Parallel to the plane, T. Okay? Now, generally what we do is we don't really define the situation here with forces like we do here. We define the situation here with stresses. So all we have to do is divide this W by the area of the plane, which is the area of the box, right? And that is the normal stress on the plane. If we divide the force that acts parallel to the plane by the area of the plane, we get the shear stress on the plane, right? So we assume that the area is relatively constant because the deformation required for failure is generally small. So you can use the area as the width times this width times this dimension here, basically, right? So width 1 times width 2. That would be the area. It's the area of the box, cross-sectional. Okay? So once you have those two parameters, this one you impose. Sigma is imposed. You decide what sigma is because you decide how much weight you're going to put on this area. Okay? And you measure this force, T. If you divide that measured force by area, you get tau. You also measure the deformation of the box. Not the box, the top part of the box. Okay? So that's what you do. That's the test. Now remember, the idea is to, let me flip this around. It's the same as here. The idea is you impose N, you measure T, and then you solve for mu. Over here, we impose sigma, we measure tau, we also measure the deformation, okay, because that's something we have to talk about actually. And then we back calculate the equivalent mu, and there's another parameter. And the mu, we actually do not call it mu, we call it something else. It's related to mu, of course, but we'll get to that later. Why do we want to measure deformation? Well, it's important to realize that for the case of a block, when you push the block and it starts moving, it starts moving, and basically that's it. But when you push a block of soil, or the top part of it, particles start moving relative to each other, and that movement actually changes or may change during the process of deformation. That interaction between the grains may change during the process of deformation. So we need to basically make a plot of the whole test, not just of the moment where the block starts moving. In fact, the block starts moving immediately after we begin the test. It is the resistance that develops here that we want to get, right? The resistance is the increase, or the, well, yeah, let's say it is the increase in force that the soil is capable of supporting, let's say. That is all captured by this plot. Picture, in this case, lab results. Paint 1,000 words, right? Deformation.